black, you're white.
Now what? What if I say the wrong thing?
You probably will. Who doesn't? But I'll do my best to listen.
Maybe if we're humble enough to listen to each other.
Maybe if we're brave enough to lean into those difficult conversations.
We might.
We could.
Come up with some answers.
Make some real progress.
Discover how much we have in common.
And appreciate our differences.
Now you're talking.
I'm David Conley, communications consultant.
And I'm Chris Thurber, clinical psychologist.
Welcome to I'm Black, You're White, Now What? Our guest tonight will be the Rev James Winfrey, who is doing a lot of work in the community with homeless as well as with youth and young people. And he also has very vast knowledge of African American history in the United States. And so we're going to tap some of that and have some great discussion just about how race affects a lot of these different areas that he's working in and what he's seeing out there. But before we do that, Chris, I'd like to, just like we always do, kind of recap what we talked about in our last episode. We had a very great conversation, and that was dealing with the perspective of an interracial couple and just how race has affected their relationship, their marriage, and their evolving point of view over the years. And so I thought it was a great, very touching conversation, and I enjoyed speaking with both men about just what they've been seeing and what they've been dealing with individually and collectively as a couple. And so I thank Andy and Brian for their contribution.
It was fantastic, and I'm also grateful that Andy and Brian were able to join us. I think the two things that I learned, or the two biggest things I learned, were, number one, they are very aware of one another and how people are treating them in group settings and mixed settings, but they don't come to each other's rescue. And I think that takes a lot of understanding and love, and they do know when to step in if they feel like the other person is going to say or do something they regret. But I'm struck by how much unspoken communication there is between them that is racially charged or racially aware. And I also was really touched at the end when Andy was talking about how much his parents, who are both still alive, have learned from Brian, from Andy's being married to, first of all, another man, and second of all, a black man, and that his parents, who are around 90 years old, have both evolved in their thinking. So for anyone who is about to write off an older generation, especially in these times when we're, most of us, trying to learn as much as we can about race and about communication, it is absolutely within anybody's capacity to learn, no matter how young they are, no matter how old they are. So that was really
never too late to grow.
Exactly. So Reverend James, we're really, really happy that you're joining us today. Thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule, and you're joining us from the Los Angeles area. Could you tell us a bit, and especially for our listeners, what it is that you do and how you got started? I understand that you and David know each other from St. Louis, but
Yes.
Talk to us a little bit about what you do professionally and personally, and then we're full of questions.
Sure. Well, I am currently the director of operations for an organization called Urban Alchemy. It's a nonprofit that is dedicated to helping those who are formerly incarcerated to experience restorative justice by serving their community. We provide employment to approximately 500 individuals who either are formerly incarcerated, former long-term offenders, or folks who are experiencing or have experienced significant homelessness. And our role basically is to champion a set of values that help them to to work in transitional workforce development jobs, and so that they can move on and give back to society. So that's kind of where we are today. In the past, I pastored for about 20 years in the African Methodist Episcopal Church.
Hmm.
And my new kind of ministry is now on Skid Row here in LA.
What brought you to that?
Wow, I tell you, I had been pastoring in the normal church environment for a number of years, and the church started reaching out and doing a lot of homeless outreach in a little town called Dothan, Alabama. And it was just a phenomenal kind of new approach to ministry. And my wife and I got excited about it. And over time, that ministry grew and grew. And there came an opportunity here in Los Angeles for us to relocate to her hometown. And so here we are since about 2016. We've been here. Started out working on Skid Row at another nonprofit where we help folks who are in similar situations find jobs and keep those jobs. And so, yeah, that's kind of how we ended up on Skid Row.
Wow.
So, are you providing, like training for like that
Definitely.
transition? How does that work exactly?
Definitely. So what we provide, first of all, we provide them, with the fishing pole, with a job. So we contract out with the city and with other nonprofits as a subcontractor to provide services to those who are experiencing homelessness. For instance, in LA, any given night, there's about 15,000 people living on the streets. Um,
15,000. Wow.
yeah, and so that's just like the city. And so they need a place to use the restroom. So, for instance, one of the things we do is we have a program called the Pit Stop Program where we actually man and attend restrooms from approximately 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., depending on the contract. And we do that throughout the city so people who are homeless can actually have the dignity of using the restroom. We provide mobile showers to folks who don't have a place to take a shower. So we probably have a fleet of about, at this point, 25 showers throughout the Los Angeles region. Um, so the folks that staff that are people who, again, are those who have experienced the criminal justice system. And what we do with those guys is not only do we give them the job, but we help them to navigate trying to become better people in terms of being employable. So, for instance, we offer de-escalation training.
The biggest barrier for anyone coming out of a period of incarceration, I'm thinking of the question that's on every single job application. Have you ever been convicted of a crime? XYZ. It's such a blessing that you and your wife are doing this work and that someone can come out of prison and have a job and not have to deal with that hurdle. But I realize as I make that observation, I don't understand the legality of what would happen or the consequences if somebody said, "Yes, I have been convicted of a crime. I'm not doing that anymore." But yes, is someone like that ever employable if they don't come through a nonprofit like yours?
Definitely, but the benefit of coming through a nonprofit like Urban Alchemy is that they receive the coaching that's necessary for them to truthfully answer that question
Okay.
when they are approached, and for them to be able to sell themselves, if you will. That's just like anybody else would have something on their resume that might be challenging to explain, like a gap in work history or something like that. They're able to do it confidently by talking about not just the skills that they learned while in prison, but also some of those um, restorative justice principles, dignity, respect, empathy, how to give back, and just the whole idea of self-discipline, self-control, those kinds of things those skills that they have now. So we're able to give them those tools. But I think
Wow.
that most folks that come out do find it kind of hard, find it kind of challenging.
Yeah.
And how difficult is it for? I mean, like I'd imagine, that's about changing habits and things like that. And even though the training is there, how difficult is that transition?
It can be very, very hard if they don't have a support network, right? So oftentimes someone will get out, they may have family members that are there, but they're not the same person they were 30 years ago. The family is not really trained to deal with some of the trauma that they've experienced while in prison. So it can be very, very tough. It depends on the person, it depends on their experience, but that's the key piece to it is to provide wraparound services, because if they don't have that support, they will end up on Skid Row in short order, and they'll be surviving just by the skin of their teeth, like a lot of folks are down there.
So you hear a lot about, like the disproportionate number of minorities, particularly African Americans, in the prison system. Is this something that's reflected in the work that you do?
Definitely, about 80% of the folks that are working with us are of African descent, and the remaining are Latino, and it reflects the prison system, reflects our criminal justice system, and the school to prison pipeline that kind of permeates our prison system here in the United States.
Can you
Talk
say
to me
a
a
little
little
bit
bit about
more
the
about?
prison school
Yeah, yeah.
pipeline.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I'm probably
No, that's
asking the
my
same
question. Go
question.
ahead, David.
Yeah, so wow, that's a huge question, but I'll try to like just kind of piece it together. We're disproportionately, when I say we African Americans are disproportionately suspended and receive um, behavioral suspensions and things of this nature. It's just a lot more folks that are people of color that experience it, and by default, those folks end up not finishing or completing their education. They end up because of their living conditions, or because of some of the prohibitive things that are happening in their communities, they end up a part of the prison system. And it happens very early. It starts out with suspensions. It ends up being, kids who are perhaps in foster care. It will roll into a few light misdemeanors, and then it'll end up being a long-term sentence, and their life is complete. They could be 18 years old. They're in. I just hired a guy the other day who was in prison at 18, and he's now 47, just getting out.
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
That's scary. And those numbers, are pretty
yeah,
sad, to hear about as an African American man with, kids or whatever too. And we try to talk to him about that because I remember hearing something years ago about how, and maybe you can speak more to this too, how they build prisons or project the need for prisons based on test scores for African Americans and other minorities in the third grade, I think it is.
yeah, yeah. They do, and it's big business. And you'd think that, like for instance, in a state like California, that's considered by most to be a very progressive state, we have one of the biggest prison industrial systems in the country, if not the biggest. Um, but yeah, they project out, and a lot of the prison systems in the United States are now privatized. And you have to understand the trajectory of prison from the time of slavery to now, right? So,
Mhm.
prison system as we know it has its infancy in Reconstruction after slavery ended, where um, people who were former slaves were made um, to end up on farms, basically. This is above and beyond sharecropping, mind you.
Mhm.
They were, in a lot of ways, criminalized so that they could be incarcerated. And that's how the earliest prison systems started. So that from then to now, it's been multi-layered and kind of complex in terms of how to explain it. But yeah, it has its roots. Law enforcement in general kind of has its roots in, uh, ironically, in emancipation of slaves.
Wow.
It really puts
So,
a
oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
well, it just puts a context around the racial tension that exists now in the domain of law enforcement that
Right.
most people don't know about, and to it's like, I don't know, out of the frying pan into the fire if
Yeah.
you're emancipated and then anything you do or almost anything you do is criminalized, but don't worry, we've got a place for you.
Right.
And it, put African American people under kind of, containment, re-enslave them, but under
Yes.
a different banner, right?
Yes. Yes. I highly recommend a book by Michelle Alexander. Perhaps you've heard it, called The New Jim Crow, which excellently lines out the history of um, slavery through through to now, and how it's even manifested in our, not just our prison system, but our parole and probation system, right? The idea that, I'll give you a really quick story. I was working at this other nonprofit, and a young man came out of prison. He had done about 15 years, and he was doing just a wonderful job, working as a truck driver on one of our business improvement districts. And then all of a sudden he disappeared. He disappeared, and about 20 days later or so, he showed back up. He's standing outside, and I'm like, "Hey, man, where you been?" And he points down to his feet. And I look down. He raises his leg, and he has on um, an ankle bracelet. And I'm like, "Wow." He's like, "Yeah, they got me." He said, "That's the state, right?" And I'm like, "Yeah." Now I'm used to ankle bracelets. People have worked for me, and I've had to like give them breaks so that they can literally sit next to a charger so that they can charge their ankle bracelets, so that nobody comes and picks them up, because if it like dies, they're gonna violate, right? So I'm used to ankle bracelets. But then he reaches down to his other leg and raises it, and there's another ankle bracelet. He said, "Yeah, this is the state, and this is the Fed." So he literally, in 2019, had two ankle bracelets, two different charges. He is out of prison. He's paid his price, but yet he is still chained,
Yeah.
by the system. And that kind of got to me.
Yeah.
Uh, I can give you an update. He's doing a wonderful job now. He's actually been promoted like twice, and is doing great work at the local nonprofit where he's working at now. I'm very proud of it. Yeah.
Fantastic.
That's awesome to hear. Reverend James, how do you give somebody in a situation like that hope?
Well, I'll tell you, the biggest the biggest thing is for them to be able to look around them and see other people being successful who have the same story. So a lot of folks that come to these nonprofits for help are recruited by other people who have experienced similar situations. Um, I find myself in the unique situation of not having been a part of the prison system, but 80% of the folks that work with me and work for me, folks who had that story.
Mhm.
And I'm incredibly indebted to them, because they offer a story that I never would have been able to know about or understand. That helps me to do my job a lot better than I ever would have been able to do it. So they encourage each other. There literally is a community of folks that encourage one another to be a better person.
and to push forward.
Powerful.
Yeah.
So let me ask you this, like, and I know there are probably some people watching or hearing who, um, would think, well, we're talking about people who are choosing a life of crime, you know,
Right.
and you know, or have chosen it, and maybe now they're trying to do better or whatever. But when you start talking about, and I know some conversations I've had about it, you start talking to people about, say, the prison industrial complex and its root in racism and the emancipation of slaves,
Mhm.
etc. A lot of that's looked at like an excuse to, uh, to give criminals a pass.
Mhm.
What do you say to that? Having, you're working with people every day whose reality may not be that.
Yeah, that's something that we experience every day, even working with partner nonprofits, people who view very strongly others who have been incarcerated, who are now free, or who are homeless, and they really try their best to make it about them, that they don't want to take any kind of responsibility as a fellow human being, to treat them just as a fellow human being, right? Um, I had a conversation the other day with a woman about whether or not to offer hand towels to people who were giving showers to. Her opinion was, hey, they're homeless. Um, they're lucky to just get a shower, right? And
Wow.
this is a partner nonprofit whose mission it is to help people who are homeless. How about that?
Right, right.
But folks, the higher up in nonprofits you get, the less you'll see people of color, like the boards of directors and things like that. A lot of the senior management, a lot of the nonprofits who are here to help others. Um, the empathy level kind of drops quite a bit because there's a disconnect, a historic disconnect, right? A political disconnect from the people who are actually trying to help. And so they do feel inclined to preach that mantra, pull yourself up by the
Mm-hmm.
bootstraps, rather than looking at the historic, systemic racism that has caused an inordinate amount of trauma in our society. And they don't see that this is a big one. They don't see that, yes, it impacts African Americans or people of color, but it also impacts everybody. It impacts them, even as someone of European descent, that we're all kind of traumatized to that deep rooted system of racism that exists in this country.
And I
One of the
think,
things that David
Chris, you
has
might
helped me,
remember,
I was just going to say, David,
we
you've
may be
helped me
about to say the same
understand
thing. Yeah.
the, yeah, importance of equal and high status in an interaction so that meaningful change can happen as long as someone is doing something even almost passive aggressively. This person doesn't need a hand towel. They should be grateful for one towel. They don't need soap. They can use a shampoo all over.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever it is that a person's doing that diminishes another person's status is an enormous roadblock to meaningful change. And it's a privilege that I have enjoyed my whole life without knowing that I had this privilege,
Mm-hmm.
until David and I had some really deep conversations about, so what is it that somebody might do? Specifically, what am I doing in the way that I interact with other people that either maintains their status, diminishes it, elevates it? And when people hear the word status, they tend to think about money and riches and bling and cars and, but on an interpersonal level, these are the kinds of things that I think so many people would benefit from understanding. And David and I have started doing some workshops that include his status cafe exercise, so that people can see. And we we push people, we don't call them out individually, but there are a lot of aha moments and people realize, oh, I just thought I was being kind of a jackass. But
Right.
they don't realize, yeah, when you're like that, there are social ripples that extend way
Yeah.
beyond that interaction. And it is, as you said, James, uh, often racially based or
Yeah.
socioeconomically based.
Right.
David, what were you also going to say there?
No, I was kind of going to ask you a question, and it's sort of related to what you were talking about. Just like kind of before this conversation, maybe now that you brought it up, even before you and I have had some conversations, I'm just curious, like, and not that you may have encountered thinking about it one way or the other every day of your life, but just was your thinking, uh, or even is it? You tell me. Just was your thinking kind of like what I'm saying with regard to, well, hey, choose this different way, and then everything will be all right. You know what I mean? Pull yourself up. Did you have, or are you familiar with pull yourself up by your bootstrap sort of mentality at all, or not? I mean, I'm not assuming that you did. I'm
Am
just
I?
curious.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Hmm.
And I think for maybe 18 or so, the first 18 years or so of my life, that is to say, before I got to college, when I was in a much more diverse community, having grown up in South Portland, Maine, which is a million people, mostly white, more diverse now in the larger cities like Portland, and by large city, certainly not by Los Angeles or Atlanta standards, right? But maybe 250,000 people in the greater Portland area. When I was growing up there, in the 70s and 80s, was almost exclusively white and very few first generation immigrants. A lot has changed in those areas, but the rest of Maine, not so much. And in that context, there wasn't even an opportunity for me to be thinking about status, really. It was just about what you were suggesting, well, both of you, working hard. And so, pulling yourself up by the bootstraps makes sense if there's a kind of uniformity to the context, or if people really are starting on a fairly level playing field, which if you have all these white people, of course there are socioeconomic differences, but there weren't really other meaningful cultural, religious, uh, certainly geographic differences. It was such a homogeneous environment that the people who did well or didn't do well were the ones who worked harder or less hard. Now, I say that as that was my belief at the time. Now, of course, I see even in a racially homogeneous and largely religiously homogeneous community, for people who began at a much lower socioeconomic level, it wasn't just a question of working hard because they had fewer opportunities afforded to them to begin with. So absolutely, I'm familiar with that, and I don't think I understood the injustice that's baked into that assumption until I got to college. And again, as I said, a whole world opened up to me that I had not been, familiar with. And it's hard. I just add this as an epilogue, as a white family. I'm married to a woman who's a first generation immigrant from Serbia. Uh, she is also white, but from very different geographic and ethnic circumstances than I was.
Hmm.
It's a challenge to teach that lesson. We live in New Hampshire now, which is also racially um, far less diverse than either Atlanta or Los Angeles, where the two of you are. And we're very fortunate that the school where I've worked for the last 21 years has young people from all 50 states and 40 different countries, and I don't think I would have stayed or felt comfortable staying in Maine or New Hampshire to raise my kids unless we could be immersed in that kind of environment. And fortunately, I do see that my own kids have not adopted some of the assumptions that, really that I grew up with and that prevented me from seeing some of what James is talking about with regard to people's status and opportunities, and the the irony of someone who is on the sort of maybe corporate level of a nonprofit, who's white, who is in their heart doing the best they can, but not seeing the nuances in the struggles that people have. You just can't unless you're. I feel, I'll just speak for myself, I wouldn't have had the insights that I've had unless two things have occurred. One, and I still have a lot to learn, but one is that people have challenged me and said, hang on, no, I don't care how many letters you got after your name. That's not right. And the other is that I've been fortunate enough to travel and be in lots of different places, to live in Los Angeles for 4 years, to live in Seattle for 4 years, to have gone back to Serbia and seen what a country is like after a horrific war, and you can't really understand some of the meaningful parts of human struggles unless you have some of those experiences. So I can't blame my parents or the people around me, but I sort of blame the circumstance of the homogeneity of my the first 18 years of my life on that's what I would blame for my ignorance.
I've got a question that I kind of like to get, hearing that from you, like both your perspectives, because from where I'm sitting, they seem like they would be interestingly different. But both of you have been exposed to people from different cultures, people from different social economic, places in society.
Mhm.
So I'm curious, like coming from where you come from, your upbringing, Dr. Thurber, and also uh, you, Reverend Winfrey, come from yours. How you, by default, view or have grown to view people who might be in situations like, say what you're dealing with, James, or even at Exeter. I know there are people from all over the place, but they still are having to move and shake in the greater, you know, society outside of the school. Do you know what I mean? So I'd imagine some of those students are hitting you with some of their experience, which would be different than like the experience you grew up with as a kid there, and coming from where they're from and thrust now into this type of society, and maybe James, you're relating on a different level with some of the people that are coming out of long-term prison sentences. Just how is your empathy being processed to deal with, what I mean, these people? And anybody can answer first or whatever. I'm just curious as to how that goes.
Go ahead, Doc. You can go ahead.
David, when you say how my empathy is being processed, can you just clarify? I mean,
Sure. Like so when you're growing up, like you said, it's even though there's different social economic levels, for the most part everybody is white. So if I'm a student and I'm going to Exeter now, and I'm from the north side of St. Louis, I'm having to deal with like when you say that. What I hear is when I went to Lincoln University, as long as you were on campus, particularly in the evening, was very black. But when you went into Jefferson City, it was not so much, depending on where you went. And in Jefferson City, I've been, called the N word to my face, and people passing by saying that I've been treated in a way that screamed the N word, like at restaurants. When I went looking for apartments, I was told over the phone, because of how I present over the phone, I was told that the apartment was available and everything was fine. Come on over and take a look at it. It's open. And when I got there, suddenly the apartment is not available anymore. There's a whole switch and temperature change when they actually see my face. So that experience, me then coming and talking to you about that experience, um, how does that hit you if I say, listen, I can't get ahead because of this? How do you process empathy for me, if at all, being somebody who didn't have to deal with that growing up? Like, how do you see that? And I'm asking that juxtaposed to James, who, obviously James has not been, in a prison sentence, unless there's some things we need to talk about offline. But at any rate, but coming from, I know, where he's come from. Uh, I would think that there would be a different sort
Sure.
of relatability to that. And so I'm just curious to hear from you all's different perspective how you would deal with, or how you have dealt with, or how you have heard, or how it's hit you, some of the things that people would say when they come and say, hey, listen, for me, getting ahead is a difficult thing. It's, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps means something altogether different for me, and so I'll say this one last thing to help maybe clarify. I kind of mentioned this on our first episode, but or something like it, but this will be different. I read a thing the other day that was saying people who say all lives matter are coming from the same place as the folks who wrote the uh, all men are created equal and then went home to their slaves.
Mm.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of like you mean that in your head, but you mean it in a way that's different. So when you say all lives matter, to me, I think you mean it from somewhere in your mind. You think that's a good place, but you may be living a different reality than that in your quiet places. And so I'm just wanting
Yeah.
to know what those quiet places are like when you think about it and consider it. Hearing some of what James is saying he's dealing with
Yeah.
on Skid Row, and then I'd like to hear what James has to say about that. Go ahead.
Well, thank you for explaining the question in more detail. And I think now I understand what it is that you're asking. And I would say I um, the the dominant feeling is helplessness. Feel like, and I would dial this back all the way to the time the 4 years that I was in Los Angeles, and as a trainee in the PhD program in clinical psychology, serving as a supervised junior clinician in a community mental health center, and getting a chance to see an amazing cross section of different people who lived in the greater Los Angeles area. And I say dominant feeling of helplessness for a couple of reasons. One is it was abundantly clear to me that I needed to say to clients or friends who were reporting on some of their experiences that reflected people's prejudice, I understand that this was really painful for you, and I also need to recognize and say out loud that it's not happened to me before. Something like that hasn't happened to me before, so I can do the best that I can to listen and, you know, hear what this injustice felt like to you, and also just recognize that there's a limit to what I am able to truly understand about what it is that you're going through, right? And I think, you know, there's in all of the research that's been done on the effectiveness of psychotherapy, the most important factor, if you look at what contributes to positive change in people's mental health, is feeling a rapport with the clinician. And that's actually, that far exceeds the power, the contribution of the particular type of therapy that you're delivering. You just have to feel connected to that person you're sitting across from. And, you know, if the person sitting across from me is not white, then I'm already knowing that there's probably something that is going to take more time or may not even be possible in terms of the human connection. So again, it leaves me feeling really helpless. I remember one of my professors in graduate school, someone that first used the expression microaggression and talked about intersectionality before the word intersectionality was popular, a professor named Stanley Sue. And we had a case study where he asked us, and the 17 or 18 people in my class included men and women and people of color and white people, and so just our group was fairly diverse, and yet we still, all of us got this question wrong in seminar. And Professor Sue said, all right, so you've got a client coming in, you read this client's intake form an hour before they arrive, and it says that they are Japanese and, you know, first generation immigrant and this and that and a few other demographic details. How are you going to best meet this client's needs? And we all said some version of, or the people who answered, well, you know, we've got an hour to try to figure out, you know, what Japanese culture is like if we're unfamiliar with it. Or we'll ask Sharon, who was one of the other students in the PhD program who was second generation, but Japanese heritage. And he said, well, you know, that's pretty useless. And we all thought, wow, really? Wow, what's, you know, just try to do a little research. And he said, do you think you're going to go to, this is pre-internet, of course, the encyclopedia and read the entry for like Japan, or, you know, skim through some book, or even listen to what Sharon has to say, you know, for 15 or 20 minutes and know something meaningful about your client? You know, and we were all humbled. And he said, you know, there's part of this that you're not going to be able to do, and the rest of it you can only figure out by asking that person, what's been your experience as a first generation Japanese immigrant who was born in Osaka and has grown up in, you know, Orange County or wherever. And it was, I mean, we were just, again, like, I felt really helpless. Like, I thought that I was going to get this fancy degree and have all these tools. And then I realized some of what I'm not going to be able to do as a clinician is because of my race. And there being, you know, this disconnect. So that's a long answer to your question, but I have always remembered, you know, Professor Sue's advice, just ask and listen and try to understand. But I also, since starting my job here at Exeter in 21 years ago, believe so strongly what Reverend James said, which is, you know, you need to be able to see someone who looks like you, who ideally has been through something similar, if you're going to have any hope. Like, I can be a really good therapist for an Exeter student who is a person of color, and I can help them to some degree. And then they also need a role model. If they don't have a clinician who looks like them, at least there's somebody on campus who does, with whom they have a connection, to whom they look up, and that is just something I, can't provide. So again, it's this feeling of helplessness that I can try really hard, but there are limits to what I can do, and I suppose that's the core of my humility, such as it is recognizing what those limits are. And so when I process, when I try to empathize, I try to do it in a way that is genuine and is as free of assumptions that I'm some kind of savior of this person, because, gosh darn it, I have a PhD, and it right? It just all piled higher and deeper, they say. Anyway, so James, can you relate to that? And
Yeah,
how is your
yeah.
experience different?
It's a really a remarkable question, and to just listen to your answer helped me to reflect on just how different our experiences are in this country, right? So my empathy comes not from the sense of helplessness, but I can so identify with the folks that I come into contact with who have these kinds of challenges because I've experienced some of the same trauma
Yeah.
that they've experienced, right? So I immediately, before I go off into that whole thing, I thought, when do I feel helpless? As someone of African descent, and when do I? And I thought, well, when I'm around a whole lot of, uh, I don't use I don't use white and black a lot, so people of European descent, uh, you know, that's pretty much when I feel pretty helpless. Is because I'm out of kind of my element, like a fish out of water, kind of. And it is only during those times where they might be experiencing some of the same trauma that I experience it that I feel probably most at home in a strange kind of a way.
Hmm.
So that if I, for instance, when I lived in Alabama, the majority of folks who were experiencing homelessness were rural folk, white folks, and and I was able to identify with a lot of the challenges that they're going through. Um, and I think that is that place where that space where all of us, no matter what our ancestry is, that place where we're all challenged the most, that place where we desire the most for our families, is such a unifying place in a lot of ways. So much so that very early in our nation's history, the folks before there was the United States, the folks that were kind of controlling all the purse strings, the landed gentry, they made sure that folks that were suffering, no matter whether they were Native Americans, Africans, or poor Europeans, they saw the unifying power of struggle and trying to get ahead, and how people can unite as one against those who oppress those who don't have. And that's why they started making those distinctions, in the 17 the 1670s, right around the time of Bacon's Rebellion. It's like these, if we don't draw a line and create this idea of white
Hmm.
and black, right? If we don't create that, because at that time, the biggest difference was, do you own land, right? Um, are you a man? Unfortunately, that was a thing. And so it was at the point where people started unifying against oppressive folks who had a lot of money that laws started being changed, and the real big pieces of chattel slavery started coming together. And these idea of, no, I'm not from Britain, I'm not from Belgium, I'm not from France, I'm white, and
Yeah.
you're other than, you're savage, or you're black. These concepts came to play, and so our experiences were different. The world that we live in now is a world where if I am um, a male of European descent, the the America that I live in, I'm going to experience others who look probably mostly like me, and you're not really like having to work through a lot of the historical challenges.
Hmm.
But on the other hand, if you are someone of African descent, a person of color, you have to learn how to navigate two worlds at a very early age. And some of us are more successful than that than others. And some of us just they never have the opportunity to. The folks who don't have that opportunity to be able to navigate, to learn how to speak the code, that needs to be spoken in a professional setting. Um, Folks who don't learn that, a lot of times they end up in the criminal justice system.
And that's
But
kind
those
of
who
what one of the things I was going to say.
mhm.
Not to cut you off, James,
Go
but
ahead.
so here's I agree and disagree. Like with both of you, I agree with you, but I disagree with the helplessness thing. And let me say this: it's your experience, so I'm not saying I disagree in that you experience
Sure,
that.
sure, sure.
I have a challenge with the notion of that though, because I feel like, for instance, there are there are commonalities in all of it that we miss because we get so blinded by the black, white,
Hmm.
or white, other color situation.
Right.
And I invite you to push back, but I'm saying let's go with the example. Both of you said something that I found was the same. So, Chris, you grew up, and you said you grew up in a pretty homogeneous situation where, for the most part, everybody was white until you went off to college and started saying, man, there are, you know, these other cultures that I'm now experiencing. I knew
Hmm.
academically that they existed, but I'm experiencing them
Hmm.
more one on one. Well, I had a similar situation when I was growing up. For the most part, everybody in my neighborhood and in my life was black, and then I got bused to school in a different area of town, and all of a sudden I'm dealing with a lot of other cultures and a lot of other people, and I'm experiencing it. But initially, my experience was all black, and James said the same thing with regard to uh, people who don't get the opportunity to live in both worlds. They are in a situation where, for the most part, everybody looks like them, and everybody is experiencing
Hmm.
this certain level of being disenfranchised or whatever. But that's not unlike what you experienced growing up with everybody being white. It's different in that the opportunities available to you are different. But you understand what I'm saying? The fact that you were in a situation where everybody looked like you and one way or the other was experiencing some version of the same thing until you come to this other situation, if you do or not. There is a place there to relate that should lessen the helplessness.
There definitely
And
is.
I'm saying, in
Yeah.
my experience, I have had the experience where people who look like me and could, not should have been able to, could relate to what I grew up with and was going through, were the least helpful to me. But the
Yeah.
people who were more helpful to me were people who were of another race, white or Asian or whatever,
Right.
and but they related to me on a human level and helped me. I'm not even talking about financially or with opportunities where they open some door. I'm talking about help me to realize some things about myself as a person, as a man, or as an emerging adult or whatever. They helped me to realize those things on a human level that was not about me being black. It was about me being a man. Now, don't get me wrong. There are some black people who helped me realize some things about myself as a black man, and that enriched me in that way. But I'm saying there was not this thing where I could only relate to black men
Right,
or
right.
black people, and
Yeah.
if I didn't have them, I was somehow going to be lost. I think there was some help in those areas, but there was a great deal of help that I got that was of equal or greater value from some people who were not black, who related to me and connected with me as a human being. And I'm saying, I think if we start kind of, which is kind of why I'm even talking about this show and things like, I think we get trained and inundated, especially these days, with how different we are. And not only how different we are, but how our differences make you deficient. You don't understand me because you're white, because you can't hang with black experience. And so
Right.
because you can't, you're somehow diminished and you're looking at me the same way. And now we never get over that. We
Right,
never
right.
get, you know what I mean, to where we push beyond that.
Right.
And what happens is we then continue to create situations where James has work. You know what I mean? We continue to
Yeah.
Right.
create situations where black people and people of color are looked at as less than, so therefore they are excellent fodder for the prison industrial complex, to the point where we're breeding them to be that, and setting them up to be that from third grade, as we talked about earlier in this episode, because of how we view their status. They're still looking at that 3/5 human thing. So I'm just saying, as long as we keep doing that, and then saying on the flip side of that, I'm either going to be racist in that I'm going to beat you with this horsewhip, proverbial or real life one, or I'm going to feel like I'm helpless, so my hands then will be off you and tied, and so I'm either going to drown you or offer you no help. Either way, I die. Either
Right.
way, I
So yeah,
drown.
no,
You know what I mean? By you sitting on the boat saying, "Dang, that's a shame."
yeah.
Swim, brother. You know what I mean? But you know what I mean. So it's like,
Well,
until we start relating to the fact that this person needs a life preserver or needs my help or whatever, until we start relating to the fact that if I was in there drowning, I would want somebody to throw me a lifeline. I don't understand why that's
I
so
think,
hard for us to get as human beings. I'm sorry. I'm through. Go ahead.
just real quick, I think that part of it is, the acknowledgement of the feeling of helplessness, but then, obtaining those tools that will, in the midst of the helplessness, allow you to find a way. So that feeling of helplessness might be there, but it's the wherewithal to, like, how do I change that feeling and turn it into action, some
What
kind of
do
way.
I do after that
Like, what do
feeling?
I do
Yeah,
after
yeah.
that? Whether, I had a CEO that, and a former another nonprofit, that, I mean, he was very, very frustrated that he couldn't. He was very frustrated in his helplessness, and we had coffee one day, and one of the things I said, "Hey, man, if you just, like, listened, that's a
Mm-hmm.
tool." So to be able
Mm-hmm.
to learn those tools,
Mhm.
I think is quite helpful. Doc.
Well, I think that's what Professor Sue was trying to say to all of us trainees is you've got to ask open-ended questions, and then you've got to listen
Mm-hmm.
to understand what somebody else's experience is. And um, I think that's James, the beauty of what you said at the end of your previous comment that prompted David's follow-up comment.
Hmm.
We've got to identify our common humanity, right? And and meet each other at that level.
Yeah.
And my response to you, David, is that fortunately, and you know this because you and I have made educational videos and things together, I'm a confident person, and I think that I I don't know where it comes from. I think encouragement from my parents, and their honesty with me about what I was doing well and not doing well. But I have never, from that feeling of helplessness, I've never just imploded and gone to a place of like hopelessness or like I can't help. I've always thought, and I think I began in a place that was arrogant, thinking, well, as people say sometimes, I don't see color. It doesn't matter. Like what matters here is that I'm a good clinician. What matters here is that I can diagnose whether this person has anxiety or depression or bipolar disorder or something like that's, and that's in a book, and it's got criteria, and it's totally objective. And can we not please like play the race card? But the helplessness I feel is on top of a lot of confidence that if I do what James was suggesting and I'm able to connect with the human experience, because of course I have had times when I felt in my life depressed and anxious and sad, and when I've been grieving, and when I felt great injustice, not racially motivated, but some other kind of injustice. So I think that I feel I can be very helpful to somebody, and I know that there are some limitations. And I also, as you did with your comment, David, I also like challenge those. I challenge people on the magnitude of those limitations. So that is a very abstract statement. Let me bring it to something very concrete that was very recent. Last night, I'm watching CNN, and Don Lemon was asking an African-American man who I don't remember whether it was a congressman or a governor, but Don was asking this gentleman, what do you think about Kamala Harris being Biden's nominee or Biden's choice for his running mate? And so there was, answer, commentary, and then Don Lemon asked a follow-up question that was very interesting. And for people who don't know or who are listening, Don Lemon is black. And he kind of stumbled through this question. I don't think it was one on the teleprompter, but it went something like, okay, and what do you think about what some people say about Joe Biden, which is that he can be a little bit too familiar with black people, or a little bit too colloquial in his style of interaction with people of African or Caribbean descent. And the gentleman's answer was, well, I have some thoughts about that, but I don't want to share them. And the interview was kind of over. And I turned to my wife, who I said is also white, and I said, that's really interesting. And here's how, guys, I think it speaks to part of what we're talking about. And I'm interested now in how the two of you would respond to this. If someone is doing the best they can to find that common humanity, is it inappropriate to at what point might it become inappropriate to either adopt language or pronunciation or jewelry or dress or topics of conversation that are like too familiar? Because I thought, like, of all the things to criticize Joe Biden for, making this choice of a vice presidential running mate, now you're saying like one of the whitest guys on the planet is acting a little bit
You
black
probably
sometimes,
should.
right?
It's probably better that you answer.
Is it?
I love this
I mean,
question.
I mean, like, a white guy from Delaware, and
Right.
like, okay, so what?
I think that the short answer is it's best to probably just play it safe and not do it. Like, just
Mm-hmm.
be you, be authentically
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Uh, there are, African Americans are not a monolith.
Of course.
Um,
Yeah.
and so you're going to have a wide range of folks. So you got folks over here who maybe grew up in the South, and a lot of the similar like cultural intonations that might come out of a white person's mouth will be the same thing coming out of a black person's mouth. Sugar, baby, those kinds of words.
Hmm.
So that person probably would not be offended. But say you get someone who's like super culturally seeking, we call them, super conscious, trying to like feel out, who they are and their identity, might be hypersensitive to someone who they see or hear using some of the same language, right? Some of the same um, phrases. Talked earlier about like this idea of code switching, right? So a lot of people don't, and this might be a whole other episode, but I mean, me and David talk a different language when we're not, professionally talking, right? We talk the language we grew up in, right? And
Right.
that would probably scare the hell out of some people. But that comes, and it's deeply rooted in everything from culture to even pre pre-slavery condition of our people, right? The long O sound. If I don't say door, when I'm at home, I say shut the door. I don't say
Mm-hmm.
pull, I say pull. I don't say I want some more, I say I want some more. Right? Comes
Mm-hmm.
with an inflection, attitude, and a different vowel sound, right? And that's just super deep, like cultural stuff. And if someone tries to like mimic it in some kind of way, it comes out kind of as contrived a little
Yeah.
bit. And so I always say like just be who you are. There are some folks that grew up. I have a fraternity brother who he grew up in the heart of North St. Louis, and all he knew how to be was what everyone around him was, which was culturally African, right? African American, and he was accepted as such, right? You couldn't tell him that he was European. You get have a fight on your hand, and
Mm-hmm.
everyone knew him, and that's just how it was. He was accepted as part of the
Hmm.
community. But someone coming in who may and have a good heart, right? Have good intentions, like Mr. Joe, and Joe's just going to be Joe anyway. But
Mm-hmm.
um, I'm thinking about some SNL sketches right now. I'm sorry.
Right, right,
We got to
right.
come
Me
back and
too.
do a whole Joe Biden
Yeah,
Yeah,
episode.
yeah.
but yeah, so yeah, that's that,
Yeah.
David. If you might have something.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say something a little similar, but honesty is the best policy, and
Yeah.
I think the short answer to that is that it will come across condescending and contrived, and the reason for that, and you just gotta always be honest and stay true to the game, but in America, the history is that you have
Mm,
seen black as deficient for so long that when you then try to do things, it smacks of blackface.
Yeah.
It smacks of minstrel show type thing where you are making fun of black people and the black experience when that may not be your intention at all. That's how it reads, and it
Yeah.
reads that way because you are not being authentically you, as James said. You're not being so that you're not being honest. And so a more lightweight version of it is I joke, or used to joke more so. They're adults now, so I don't do it as much. But when when the kids were teenagers, I would go in and try to. They would know I was joking and everything, but part of the shtick was that I was speaking the kids' slang. They knew that I was hip and I was down
oh
with the
yeah,
way the kids talk today,
right,
and
right.
but it's so over the top that they know I'm not being,
Yeah.
but that's how I'm going to relate to you, kids, and we would have a nice laugh about it, and they would know that I was not being serious, but but that's how that can come across, because that's not who you are for real. And so you should just be honestly you, and people can relate. And the thing is that black people have had to, like James said earlier, live in those two worlds, because if I come saying dough and flow like I do at the house, you don't hire me. And if you hire me, you certainly don't promote me out of the janitorial pool. So
Exactly.
in order for me to get ahead, I had to come in and make sure that my English was correct. I had to make sure that I could speak in a way that was palatable to those people in the boardroom. And so you didn't ever have to really do that, because you weren't really trying to come to speak to folks in my neighborhood, or speak to, if you were speaking to the people down in the janitor's office, it was to tell them to come clean up your office. It
Right.
wasn't that you were trying to get ahead in the janitor's office, so you
Right.
had to come down.
Right.
So there was no consequences for you in that way. So anytime you were doing it in a way that was to make fun of or whatever. So when you then do that to say, and you do it as a politician, especially, it really
Yeah.
says you're
And people
pandering,
see it immediately.
and
Yeah.
they see it immediately, and
Even
it's off-putting immediately because of that history. So that's why that is. It's not like, oh, Joe's a great guy in that way. And I'm saying
Right.
saying that to say I think Joe's a great guy, and I think Joe's intentions are
are pure.
good. I am pure, but I'm saying it's hard to fight that history, man. It
Right.
just is, and
And can I
so
just say that it's in the midst of a people trying to figure out who they are still, right?
right,
So we, African Americans are people who are struggling to figure out what their identity is in this world. So there's a lot of different opinions about who we should be and what we should be called, and those kinds of things. And so that it even bleeds over into politicians like Kamala Harris or a Barack Obama, um, folks who don't have who are not American descendants of slavery, right? Who have other other kinds of experiences. When they come in and they code switch, there's a group of us that sit back and say, So even within, you
Yeah.
know, that community, you can look, and I heard an interview from Kamala Harris the other day, and I heard her like turn it on. And they questioned her blackness. She turned it on, right? And I said, I just kind of something in me just said, you know, and so that's just an interesting nuance. So even
Yeah.
if people of color are struggling with it, then definitely folks are, who are not would struggle all the more.
but also let's keep it real. It's about the honesty of whether or not you think black culture in that way is valuable. And America has always thought that black contributions were valuable when it comes to entertainment, and that's primarily acting in front of the camera,
Yeah.
music, when it comes to performing or sports. But when it comes to stuff like making policy and things like that, we're still having the first black president. We're still having the first female
Yeah.
black, vice president. I'm saying in 2020, these are still first, and you still haven't had like the first of a lot of other, races or whatever. So I mean, let's. It's always funny because that thinking is, well, hey, everybody's been, equal and everything is fine. I don't understand what the problem. The problem is that in America, you do not really find that valuable. And here's the thing: everybody will act like. Let me go back and say this, and you can check me on it. But when Barack Obama was elected president, one of the biggest unspoken fears was that he was going to go into the White House and then start having barbecues on the lawn. He was going to hire all his family. He was going to do all these ghetto stereotypes, which, in my opinion, this is my opinion, that has only happened after he was out of office. Almost everything you thought he was going to do as a ghetto president has been done after he got out of office. There, I said it. I'm just saying it's funny, but that's what you thought was going to happen. That somehow he was going to go in and black the office. He was going to blackify the presidency, and even so, now all of a sudden the motorcade was going to be with some Buick Deuce and the quarters. It was going to be, it was just going to be this whole ghetto experience, and that did not happen.
And
But
that speaks to like the value of our culture, though, right? Like
mhm, mhm.
both ourselves and the people who look at us to say that's ghetto when it's our culture. We
Right,
say and that's ghetto instead of our village. That's the hood.
right,
That's our
right,
village, right?
right.
And it's only valuable if it can be monetized,
Hmm.
right? Jazz music was just jazz music until they figured out a way to
Right,
monetize it.
right.
Hip hop,
Right.
when I was 8 years old. You were 8 years old when it came along. Was like it'll pass until it was
Hmm.
monetized. So that's another the big fear we have. But it also speaks to like the fact that some of the ghetto things happen post Obama. It speaks to some of the very similar things that we do
Hmm.
that we could connect on levels, um, that don't
Once you stop
turn those
making them deficient because they're attributed to black people, the minute you stop doing that, when if you look at it as a principle, it's a whole different thing. Running the numbers was considered N-word pennies until such time as it was making a bunch of money. Now it's the lottery. I'm just saying it's a whole, and the minute you start putting value on it, it comes out of the hood. It comes out. It becomes this whole other thing. You change the name. It all of a sudden it's different. But the minute you're thinking about it as black and deficient, it's a whole different thing. And so
Right.
that I'm saying that to say when people start looking at Joe as doing that, it's because coming out of his mouth, it speaks to how you were looking down at it at first, and now all of a sudden, it seems dishonest, and that's
Yeah.
the long answer to that, you know.
Very interesting. Real quick,
Mm-hmm.
there's a guy named Alonzo Herndon who lived in Atlanta, Georgia. He was a slave. He walked from his town to Atlanta, Georgia. Poor. His father had been a slave master, and he noticed that insurance salesmen would not sell insurance to people of color, to black people. So he'd ride around on his bicycle and he would sell a kind of insurance to blacks for like a nickel. And that started the Atlanta Life Insurance Company. Um, Here was a man who had been a slave, and no one took note of what he did until after he started doing it. And that's when many people, many folks of European descent tried to buy his insurance company. That's just a good example of like how that works, so much
Mm-hmm.
for us. I don't know how we get into that, how we went down that rabbit hole, but very interesting. The Herndon Mansion is right there in Morris Brown's campus in Atlanta. So,
It's interesting.
Well, Reverend James, I'm, I know I speak for David when I say we're really grateful for the time that you've spent with us, and I feel like there's so much more to talk about, and we've only just scratched the surface of the wonderful work you do with your nonprofit. So I hope that you'll come back and have another discussion with us. Um, I feel like there's so much that people in general, and I'll say for myself, that I need to learn about uh, the systems such as the prison system that continue to contribute to oppression in different ways
mhm.
until you're in it or until you understand parts of it. Uh, you're just ignorance is bliss, and I think part of the part of the, use the word disconnect earlier, I see a disconnect that causes a lot of anger in white people because they just are not seeing kind of like what's the big deal. And it's, I feel like it takes time and focus and a desire to learn more before somebody understands why it is and has been for a very long time a very big deal. My hope is that so much of what is being injected into our culture right now, and maybe in greater doses since George Floyd's death, is that that people will respond with, "Gosh, I really need to learn about this," rather than push it away. This is uncomfortable, and that is the reason that David and I are doing this show, because we want to make more accessible conversations like the one we had with you today, where people can share their experience, share their wisdom, and the hope is that listeners walk away with something they didn't have before, and a deeper sense of compassion, and to circle back around to this notion of helplessness, feel less helpless, feel like they do have a sense of agency. And as you said earlier, James, at the very least, listen.
Right. Big one for all of us.
And absolutely. And when you come back, James, I want to really get into just more of how policy and things are put in place with the design of marginalizing a people. I don't think a lot of people realize how much that exists even still today, and how, when those that have get ready to exploit certain people, that it's done deliberately,
Yeah.
and then people end up, being a product of that, but looked at as if they are just less than and criminal and what have you. And I think it's important that people recognize how, generations, people put that in place so that it reaps dividends on people's lives generationally. And I think that we need to kind of discuss that too. So when you come back, I look forward to being able to talk about that.
Well, thank you guys. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you so
man,
much
for your time and your insights. Thank you for listening to I'm Black, You're White, Now What?
You can find more episodes on the podcast channel Teaching What It Takes, available on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify.
To learn more about the work I do, visit www.preparingthepath.com.
And to learn more about the work I do, visit drchristhurber.com.